welcome back to Timeline of World History. Today we finish off the 6th millennium BC by heading to the Pontic steppe of Russia. This is an area of 384,000 square miles that is bounded by the East European forest steppe to the north, the Black Sea to the south, the Kazakh steppe to the southeast, and extends to the western shore of the Caspian Sea in the Dagestan region of Russia. The steppe itself covers the remains of the Turgai Sea that extended south and east of the Ural Mountains and covered much of the West Siberian plain in prehistoric times. In the 6th millennium BC, the area became the homeland for nomadic pastoralists. According to the Kurgan hypothesis, this was the starting point for the Proto-Indo-European language and domestication of the horse. We will start with the Samara culture in 5500 BC. The Samara was a culture that emerged in the late 6th and early 5th millennium BC at the Samara Bend region of the Middle Volga River. It was discovered during archaeological excavations in 1973 near the village of, Syesheye in Russia. The valley itself contains sites from subsequent cultures that are described as Samara cultures or Samara Valley cultures. The Samara culture itself is reserved for the early culture of the region. The Samara occupied the forest steppe terrain of the Middle Volga, with a separate North Caspian culture occupying the Lower Volga to the south. Maria Gimbutas described this range as the homeland for speakers of the Proto-Indo-European language to have exchanged terms with Uralic language speakers. If this was indeed the homeland of the Proto-Indo-European people, then this is important for studies of the later Indo-European people who moved into Europe, the Near East and Central Asia, forming daughter languages across the now expanded range. This steppe area lay at a crossroads between both east and west and north and south that received influence and stimulation from many different people. Gimbutas claims that the Proto-Indo-Europeans were a warrior culture who attacked cultures that were non-warlike in nature. People were buried in single shallow pits covered with a stone cairn or low earthen mound. This was the forerunner of the later kurgan or burial mound, in which the deceased chief would ascend to the sky god. Yes, remember Kurgan from the movie Highlander? He was one of these guys. Inside, remains of animal sacrifice were found over most of the sites. At Syesheye, heads and hoofs of cattle, sheep and horses were placed in shallow bowls covered with ochre over the grave. Does this mean that the horses were sacrificed? Horse images carved from bone were placed in the ochre deposit above ground. This suggested that horses had an importance in both Samara and later Kvalynsk cultures, unlike other Neolithic cultures that placed importance on domesticated cattle and sheep. This points to the first domestication of the horse. These finds found that Samara and Kvalynsk sites have been dated to between 4800 and 4400 BC. Despite this, it cannot yet be determined whether these horses were ridden or were sacrificed for meat. Other objects found in graves included flint and bone daggers, bone spearheads, flint arrowheads, bone figurines, pendants, and bone plaques of horses or double oxen heads. One other thing that the Samara is known for is its unique style of pottery, even though they did not practice agriculture. Their style of pottery consisted of egg-shaped beakers that were decorated, incised, stabbed or impressed with a comb to produce circular motifs, lines, bands, zigzags or wavy lines. When viewed from the top, it appeared to reveal a solar motif, later developed into a representation of the sun. As the pottery was unable to stand on a flat surface, it would have been supported by baskets or slings before being slung over the shoulder or carried on pack animals. It is not known when the Samara culture came to an end. The next time we will visit the steppes will be in the 4th millennium BC, when the Yamna culture appears on the scene. But now, let us move northwest to northern Germany and Denmark, where Mesolithic people have been carrying out their hunter-gatherer lifestyle for the past 5,000 years. Located in the small village of Ertebölle, this I can pronounce because it's Danish and I'm Swedish, on Limfjorden in Danish Jutland, the Ertebölle culture was a hunter-gatherer and fisher culture dated to the end of the Mesolithic period. The population settled either on seasonal or year-round basis, on promontories, near beaches, on islands and along rivers and estuaries. They took advantage of warm and wet environmental conditions that had resulted from the Atlantic climate period. The culture was linked to the Ellerbeck culture of Schleswig-Holstein, bordered to the north by the Scandinavian Nøstvet and Lithult cultures, and was contemporary with the linear pottery culture further south. Although the Ertebölle did not practice agriculture, it did utilize domestic grain by obtaining this from the south. The population derived its main living mainly on fish. Dozens of species of fish have been found in middens that included pike, whitefish, cod, ling, anchovies, sticklebacks, eel, flatfish, herring, perch, and deep-sea fish such as sharks. In the 1890s, the National Museum of Denmark excavated tons of oyster shells at Ertebølle that were mixed with mussels, snails, bones, bone antler and flint artifacts, which were evaluated as kitchen middens or refuse dumps, hence the alternative name of the culture as kitchen midden. 3 methods were used to catch these marine resources. Firstly, they constructed fish fences or weirs, made from 4-meter long hazel sticks that were set upright into the mud at the bottom of shallow water. Fish were herded into these fences or weirs by some unknown method before being harvested for the dinner table. The second method was to angle using hooks made from red deer bone, in which one has been found with its line still attached. The third and final method was to create spears made from shafts in which hazel was attached. They did this by the construction of paddle dugout boats. The paddles themselves were made from shafts in which leaf-shaped or heart-shaped blades were attached. This enabled people to master the inland waterways. The presence of deep-sea fish and sharks indicated that some fishermen ventured out into the Baltic Sea, although whether they did so in their dugouts or had larger ocean-going boats remains to be seen. Evidence for the remains of killer whales, dolphins and seals have been found at Lystrup Enge, Yderhede and other sites. This raised the question as to whether a whaling or sealing industry existed, or whether they just came from scavenging on the shore. There is no evidence that people ventured out into the Baltic Sea to harpoon whales, but intriguingly, one of the 2 types of pottery found was a blubber lamp, a small oval dish that contained a chunk of blubber or oil. This implied that a widespread industry occurred to obtain blubber from whale and seal hunting. Regardless of whether they fished in the rivers or in the Baltic Sea, they would have had to find some way of keeping warm in the cold water. Seems that they covered the bottoms of their boats with a layer of clay that supported hot coals. That sounds really dangerous. Inland, people hunted for a wide variety of animals, from large forest browsers to fur animals and maritime birds. They gathered berries for their own consumption and used seeds from various plants to make into gruel. Some food was imported from the south, as evidenced by grain impressions inside their pottery. Why would they need grain when they had enough of a decent diet from the various flora and fauna? It seems that they required the grain to produce beer. Analysis of charred remains indicated that some was used to ferment a mixture of blood and nuts. Nice. As stated, people lived either seasonally or on a year-round basis. When they did settle, they constructed huts from brush that were supported by posts for the purpose of storage and sleeping. Most village functions were performed outdoors, taking advantage of the mild winters associated with the improved climate conditions. Fire pits were built outside the huts as a focus for these ceremonies. At Ronaes Sky, an external fireplace was constructed as a perimeter of stones that surrounded a mud and clay hearth in which wood collected from the shore was burnt. We have already mentioned that some pottery was used to store grain or for usage as an oil lamp, but how were they created? Clays from the area were tempered with sand that were crushed with stone and other organic material, known as the EBK pot. It was using a coil technique before being fired on an open bed of hot coals. This type of pottery seems to be related to the Samara culture in the Volga, which spread up the river along the eastern Baltic and then westwards along the shoreline to reach the Ertebölle. This shows that you did not need agriculture to have pottery. As well as the construction of an oil or blubber lamp, people made a type of pot-bellied beaker that narrowed at the neck with an outward turning rim. The bottom of the beaker formed into a point or funnel that supported the beaker when it was placed either in clay or sand. It was decorated with horizontal bands, impressed with either the fingertip or fingernail. As the years went on, different motifs that included chevrons, cord marks, and animal bone punctures were added onto the pottery. Handles were used and rims started to turn inwards rather than outwards, with different sizes ranging from 8 to 50 centimeters in height and 5 to 20 centimeters in diameter. It seems that people used jars for a variety of purposes that were either set inside the hut, by the fire pit, or in the clay layer at the bottom of the dugout boat. Their toolkit consisted of small flake axes, long lithic knives, arrowheads, wood prongs and points, antler parts, and carved boon tools. Regards to their art, Paddles found that Tybrindvig showed traces of developed and artistic wood carving technique. People polished and engraved non-functional pieces of bone or antler. Geometric motifs with anthropomorphic or zoomorphic forms were predominant, along with evidence of amber representations of birds, boars and bears. Animal teeth or decorative shells were used as jewelry. There is no indication that any of this art represented wealth and status. So how were people buried? It seems that both burial and cremation was used. Women were buried wearing necklaces and belts made of animal teeth and shells. Red ochre and deer antlers were placed in some graves. This may have implied some form of social distinction between individuals, although we have said that there was no evidence of wealth and status. One unique burial at Møllegabet contained an individual buried inside a dugout boat. This could be the beginning of the long tradition of Scandinavian boat burials. It wasn't just humans who were buried. At Skateholm, dog graves were found that contained ochre, antler and grave goods. It seems that man's best friend was treated in the Ertebölle culture much the same way as human beings. In 4100 BC, the Ertebölle expanded along the Baltic coast as far as Rügen. This did not last, as 200 years later it was superseded by the funnel beaker culture. We will return to Europe in the next episode, but for now let us head to our final culture of the 6th millennium BC in northeast China. In 6500 BC, the Huli culture emerged in Shandong, China. These people lived in square, semi-subterranean houses domesticated dogs and pigs and were the first to cultivate millet. The successor culture to the Huli was the Beixin culture in 5300 BC. This was named after the type site of Beixin that was excavated from 1978 to 1979 in Tengzhou in Shandong, China. 50 sites have been discovered so far in central and southern Shandong and northern Jiangsu provinces. These sites showed evidence of millet cultivation and domestication of water buffalo, pigs and chickens. People fished for carp, hunted deer and gathered wild pears, roots and tubers. Hemp fibers were used to weave fabric for clothing, make baskets and to produce thread, twine and rope for their fishing nets. Settlements consisted of circular semi-subterranean houses, a change from the square-shaped houses of the Huli. As was common for the early Neolithic cultures, separate areas were used for housing and burials. Both of these were clustered in small groups that indicated a family or clan structure in both life and death. Later graves contained tools, weapons and other artifacts that indicated the development of an early type of ceremonial burial. These people tended to live peaceful lives. No indication of violence has been found on human remains. No indication of violence has been found on human remains. That's pretty great. Disease and old age was likely to be the cause of death. There was no sign of any internal strife or conflict with neighboring cultures. As a result of this, population growth was steady over the period between 5300 and 4100 BC. People enjoyed a nutritious diet of millet, pork, venison, chicken, eggs, and fruits and vegetables. Not bad for a Neolithic culture. Artifacts from the culture included stone axe heads, spearheads and arrowheads for hunting, and stone sickles to harvest millet. In 4100 BC, the Beixin culture was replaced by the Daven Ku culture. In the next episode, we will start covering the 5th millennium BC. A major Neolithic culture would emerge in the Yellow River Valley of China that would last for approximately 2000 years. The Ubaid culture would start to influence the Neolithic cultures of northern Mesopotamia. And we head to Egypt for the first time to look at how Neolithic culture started in the Nile Valley. For now, it's time to say goodbye from Shane of Timeline of World History and me, the fan of history, Dan. Until next time, enjoy your history and goodbye.